Okay, great. Well, we will go
Fabulous.
ahead and get started here. Melissa, take us away.
Of course. Well, thank you all so much for joining. As you can see, our very high production value of Melissa and Megan Productions. We are in a Zoom webinar format, so we cannot see or hear you. The chat is disabled, but we do have the live Q&A. So I first want to say thank you so much for taking the time to join us, whether you are here with us live right now or you are watching this on the playback. Megan and I are really thrilled about this presentation. We've been really excited pulling this content together for you and hope that you find it helpful in your grant endeavors. My name is Melissa Griggs. I am part of the Learn, Design, Apply team. I am one of the directors on the collaboration team. So again, we're super thankful that you're here. We do have the Q&A going. You can adjust your screen if you want to see the speaker view or you want to see the content. You should be able to have those controls. Know that Megan and I are sort of tag teaming this effort, and so we will monitor that Q&A and try to take your questions as they come. If we miss something, we are definitely designating time at the end of our presentation to be able to address some of those questions. And then also know if we don't have the answer to your question, we are never afraid to say we don't know. We will get back to you. That's what makes us good at our jobs, is we want to be thoughtful in our responses. So if we can't answer your question in real time, we will absolutely follow up. This is a webinar that's being recorded, so if you've registered, there will be a playback link as well so that you can reference the content for future use. So with that, I will hand it off to my colleague Megan to introduce herself and tell you a little bit more about Learn, Design, Apply.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melissa. And echoing what Melissa said, very glad to have everyone here with us. I have been excited for this for a long time, so I'm glad we're finally here. About us, who we are. So Learn, Design, Apply is a grant management and consulting firm. I won't read this verbatim, but we help public and private entities secure funding for from programs to meet their needs. We have a few different teams in LDA. I am here representing our broadband team. Melissa is here and she represents what we call our collaboration side. We cover a lot of industries, so if you are interested in something, we probably have a resource from it, and if not, we want to. So we do, again, things such as school safety, in addition to broadband, in addition to our kind of flagship USDA DLT, and really we're looking to help clients meet their needs through funding. And that's broadly about us. One thing I do want to point out that I think is an important difference that we like to make sure folks know is that some of us are able to write grants and some of us are not able to write grants. So if you are interested in grant writing, please do let us know, and just, we'll make sure that we can put you in the right direction, whether internal for us or external grant writers.
Absolutely. So you're about to write a grant. And as I mentioned, Megan and I are going to sort of tag team this effort with some best practices, with some tips and tricks. And as you all, whether you are here because you were invited or referred, or you saw posts on LinkedIn, we are looking at grant funding in the age of billions and trillions, to be honest with you. Funding that we've not seen in our lifetimes, and it's a lot. It's absolutely a lot. So I love Megan's gift that she's inserted, because this is what it takes to write a grant. I want to give a quick disclaimer that we work with foundation, state, and federal opportunities. We run the gamut of funding. So always refer to the Federal Register or your program officer if this is a federal opportunity. If you are working with the state or a foundation, always that is your number one go-to for guidance and support. But these are some best practices and some tips and some tricks that we have learned in our careers and our experience with grant writing. So I will let Megan get us started. And again, please feel free to utilize that Q&A as we go through. And again, know that if you are taking copious notes, if we've got grant writers who are actually with us, that we will make this available for playback as well. So Megan, take us away.
All right. So jumping right in, Read the fine print. This is my first tip and trick between us that I think is an important one to always remember. So grant applications can be very long. Some are short, you get 20 pages. Some can be 300 pages. And it is tempting to flip to the section that gives you the exact rules of what they want to see, what you have to write in a narrative. Don't do that. I know it can be overwhelming, but reading the fine print in a grant can really serve you well. We have found that a lot of those end pages of grants can give good notes about the funding and what your reporting requirements might be, which can then affect your timelines, which you need to put in that middle part of the grant, so to speak. Footnotes. Footnotes contain clues about expectations. A great example of this is that we found a footnote once in page 35, footnote 18, that wanted you to cite something in a very specific way. So even though it may seem tedious to read the footnotes, it's really important you do, because again, those give you clues about what a reviewer wants to see and what the grant requires of you. That kind of goes into rules can be in unexpected places as well. They're pretty much a partner there, but again, re-emphasizing that it is important to read the whole thing to make sure you capture all of the rules and requirements. Another tip here, wording can guide your narrative. So people who have put together these grant NOFOs or the rules and guidance have spent a long time doing so. And typically they have thought a lot about what words they use that are reflecting what the aim and the goal of the program is. So make note of the terminology and phrasing that is used to make sure that you address that in your narrative. Make sure you're even repeating back the exact kind of phrases and wordings that they seem to repeat, because that's what they want to hear. So by using those in your narrative, by finding those in the fine print, you're going to show that the reviewer that you have a full and complete and comprehensive understanding of this program, what it means, what's the goal, and what it's requiring of you as an applicant.
And so Megan, I'll add, sorry to interrupt. I told you.
Oh no, this is, don't worry people, this is the format, is us interrupting each other.
Well, and we had talked about rules being in unexpected places. And as Megan was giving her specific example, there are programs, and I am not going to name the agency, but there are multiple agencies that don't know what questions folks have until they ask them. So when an agency or a funding program offers a webinar, it's really important to participate in as many of those as you can and read the FAQs that result, because I have definitely seen very specific rules around percentages of budget and things that need to be included that are not actually in the grant guidance, but they are referenced in a webinar. So just wanted to give a tidbit and trick, especially to those unexpected rules. Participate in any webinar, read any FAQs, as well as the guidance.
Absolutely. And I would agree with that, Melissa, especially since we're seeing a lot of new programs coming out with this big influx of funding that's come both from COVID and then the infrastructure law. So there's a lot of new programs. So as you said, Melissa, they might not fully know all the exact rules and requirements that they will require until someone asks them. So great point. Definitely attend all the webinars you can, and don't be afraid to ask for clarification if you're not finding it in those 300 pages of the guidance. My next tip, I know, right? We read it. We suggest you do too. Number 2 is remember your audience. So kind of tying in, this big influx of funding means that we need a lot more reviewers. And oftentimes this can result in reviewers with less industry knowledge. So my example here comes from broadband, but this is really applicable to any kind of grant you write. When you are describing something, use words that a reviewer will understand. So it could be in broadband that you have a reviewer who has been in the industry for decades. They can read this paragraph here and understand it first time through, no problem. You're going to have other reviewers who read this 2, 3, 4 times because there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of phrasing that might not be familiar. And the more times a reviewer has to read through something, the less likely they are to feel positive about your application, right? You're going to find them feeling frustration, and you don't want that. You want someone to be able to understand your grant the first time they read it through. So what I always say is that when you're putting together some of these descriptions is to picture, in this case, a network diagram or a map of what broadband is and describe that picture. The same can be said for any kind of equipment that you might be describing. I know with some DLT, sometimes there's some medical things that look very confusing. And if you just take the specs from the product sheet, that might be quite similar to this, where we don't know what all the acronyms are, what the terminology is. So picture that piece of equipment and what it does and describe it that way. So think about having, a 102 college course where someone has a little bit of knowledge, but you still need to make sure that they're familiar with what things are. Again, C++ optics and a loss budget of 32 dB. I've been doing this for quite a while, and I might need to remind myself even now of what exactly that means. And if I have to, then definitely a reviewer is going to have to as well. Melissa, I kind of used an example there from DLT, which I know is your wheelhouse, but
well, and I think it's a really great point, and we're not saying don't be specific in what you're proposing. There's definitely a time and a place, specifically in a budget narrative or a budget justification, where you really do need to show that you have done your due diligence and looking at certain things, that you are pricing things appropriately. Obviously, grants are asking for funding, and funding are based on your budget. So there is a time and a place to use that very specific language, but also in narrative portions and in that review, being sure that they understand why this is necessary. Yes, as Megan mentioned, product 743-2 doesn't mean anything to a reviewer. It is, how is this necessary and how do you justify this use? So while there is definitely a time and a place, specifically in broadband, and Megan speaks the language of feeds and speeds and ups and downs that I don't understand at all. So we do recognize that there are those places, but many of the times the person reviewing your grant is not an expert in the realm of what that funding opportunity is for. DLT specifically is a distance learning and telemedicine grant through the USDA, but it doesn't necessarily mean these are technology or medical experts. So having that availability to provide layman's terms as well, I know for me is very important. And to a reviewer, as Megan said, the last thing you want someone is frustrated and confused and having to reread something when they may have dozens of narratives to read as well. So absolutely.
Exactly. Number 3 tip is a Melissa tip.
And Megan, I don't know if I am not controlling the screen from our Megan and Melissa production. So
key feature of Megan Melissa Productions.
I apologize for having to run slides, but absolutely. No, tip number 3 is paint a picture. And so as I mentioned, and I want to start it as kind of a good segue to what we were talking about, the reviewers of these grants, God bless them. Thank you so much for all that you do when you are reviewing these narratives. But there are lots of them. There are lots of words. There are lots of sections. So you want your grant to stand apart. Typically, when you are going after a funding opportunity, there are certain areas that are prioritized or for special consideration, as an example, or you are, if at the very generally speaking, would be looking at underserved communities. More times than not, that's what funding follows, is problems. So not to downplay it, but it's a lot of the same information over and over. And if you are tasked with reviewing a dozen grants or maybe more, depending on how many the program receives for that opportunity and applications and responses, painting that picture is incredibly important. Megan, something you said about unlocking your brain with sensory words and descriptors. So you can see the two sentences that Megan has provided for us. And again, I won't read slides to you. We don't want this to be that kind of webinar, but they hit differently. It means something. You've humanized these communities and these audiences where it's not just data collection and statistics and research. It starts to hit home. Another thing I wanted to add to using those descriptive words is don't be afraid to address your challenges and your pain points. As I just said, funding follows problems, challenges, pain points. It's there to address a need that without that funding opportunity may not be able to be addressed or resolved. And so I've worked with a lot of organizations, and I'm going to use K-12 school districts as an example. Educators are at the very top of my list of hold the best standards for what it is they do. I am the mom of 4 kids in public schools, so I cannot say enough about this. And I know how many hats people in education wear. I know what they are doing on very little. And so it's really hard sometimes to admit we have a problem here. We have a lack of mental and behavioral health providers. We have a lack of professional development for our students. So a lot of times organizations don't want to talk about those things because they don't want to highlight where they're having shortfalls. They just want to talk about where things are going well. So when we say paint a picture, we want you to paint a very accurate picture of those challenges and recognize that in grants, sometimes bad is good because that's what's going to make you competitive. It's what's going to tell your very personal and unique story for your communities or the communities you're proposing to serve. And it's going to be what makes a competitive application. So that's my advice for painting a picture. Megan, I know that you're going to have some.
I mean, I would say
comments after the fact.
I mean, I would say, but to your point of humanizing this, right? That's what these things do. And I'm going to talk about that little last point there real quick. This is just me being a grammar nerd, right? So using active verbs and adjectives, those are grammatically, when you break it down, the words that humanize, right? So this is using passive versus active when you're writing. Passive typically or usually uses the verb to be, but when you make it active, you're making it present and you're making the reviewer feel, right? So even though that last one seems like very technical and your 8th grade grammar teacher, might be disappointed if you don't remember, when you're writing, think about how to make someone feel, and you're going to probably end up using active verbs, right? So I know I just didn't want to scare people off of this webinar by having, some actual grammar terms in here. But it all comes back to what you said, Melissa, about humanizing your project and being honest about what, is probably a bad situation. That's why we're seeking funds in the first place. So
I will say, I mean, we use this at Learn, Design, Apply all the time. Cry me a river and I'll build you a dam. I mean, that's what funding is intended to do, is address these problems. So use those active verbs, use those humanizing words, unlock the part of the reviewer's brain and make it interesting. At the end of the day, it can be boring. I hate to say that because I'm sure every grant you all have ever written is just fascinating, but having read many grants, and especially when they're from the same program and you feel like they can be the same story over and over, that's really, really key to making sure that you have a compelling narrative when it comes to your grant. While still telling the truth, which leads us to our next slide.
Which is contextualize your statistics. So I will take this one, which is, as Melissa said, tell the truth about your statistics. So numbers don't lie is a lie. 100% stealing that phrase from a different colleague of mine because I thought it captured this perfectly. Numbers don't lie is a lie. So a poverty rate of 20% means something very different when there's 4,000 people in a location compared to 20% poverty in an area with a population of 1 million. Right? So you need to give context to your statistics to make them make sense and to put them in perspective. So showing your data with context means comparative data. So comparing it to county data, to state data, to US data. And without that kind of comparison, that context, sometimes your data points have very little meaning, right? So again, when you're saying 20% poverty, what does that mean in comparison to where you are? And, be honest about it. It might look better one way or another, and so you might not put that context, but that is something reviewers can spot. So don't do that. Give your context to make them make sense, and to be honest about your project. The last one there, get creative with your stats. So this does not mean lie. I'm not telling you to fudge your stats or present them in a way to make them seem more favorable to you. But think outside the box about the statistics that you're presenting. So again, this is a little bit of a broadband example, but if you are in a city that is hosting some sort of tournament, some sort of big event, you're going to be needing a lot of bandwidth, there's going to be a lot of broadband usage. You want to make sure that you have the infrastructure to accommodate such a large event. If you're doing Olympics, so, shout out to some of our cities that are coming up hosting Olympics, you have to think about road infrastructure. What kind of grants are you going to get for transportation? So thinking outside the box of, not just poverty, not just rurality, but what's happening in your community. If you're a smaller community, there's been a lot of migration from COVID to more rural communities. That means you're going to have an increase in certain needs, right? So thinking kind of creatively about how you can present this in a different way, and what that way is that also supports your need. This is going to be another thing that's going to make your application stand out, right? Because we're all, as Melissa said, presenting the poverty data, presenting the need data. When you think creatively with it, that's going to make it stand out. That's going to stick in a reviewer's mind. So get creative with your stats means, think about it in kind of a new way. And what else can you pull in? We also hadn't had a GIF in a while, so I'm throwing in a GIF again of Schitt's Creek. It's a theme. We are obsessed with grants. We are David in this situation. So it had been too long without a GIF. So moving on then, a Melissa point. Oh, or did you want to go back and ask me more about statistics?
No, I did want to look at David on the screen for a
little bit longer. Don't worry, guys. I think there might be some more gifts coming up. So if you missed that, David.
No, point number 5 is one that is, I think, maybe more relevant today than in many years past, and that is about engaging your community. And the reason that I say it might be more relevant is, again, this webinar was titled Funding in the Age of Billions. This influx in funding from the administration, just from stimulus, different reasons, the need to update our nation's infrastructure. I'm super young, so I won't say I have years and years of experience. So, but in my time working in the grant industry, the partnerships and the collaborations are not only something that have maybe always been encouraged, but many times are absolutely required at this point. We're seeing lots of funding opportunities like EDA funding, for example. So your Economic Development Administration, where you have to have parts of your application that may include a nonprofit or include state and local government, as well as training received from higher education organizations, community and technical colleges, and your regional employers who need this new skilled workforce and training. That's just one example. So starting to foster these community relationships is never too soon. As I mentioned in some of the infrastructure bill, we'll see this funding come out over the next 5, 6, 10 years. So having these relationships formed now, also when we're seeing millions, billions, trillions of federal funds that then go to state and local agencies that have to turn those funds around through their own competitive programs. There's going to be time and planning and research and evaluation to figure out how we're going to roll out these competitive opportunities. And it's going to differ from state to state, from potentially county to county and municipality to municipality. So foster those relationships, have those conversations, get in front of your state and local government to start these conversations, to say how you feel, you might be deemed an anchor community, just as an example. So, never too early to start those conversations. And again, when it comes to a specific grant application that you are pursuing, there are multiple methods, and we encourage multiple methods to foster and document and demonstrate that community support. So it doesn't have to be a one size fits all thing. Now, I will say sometimes there are formal MOUs that need to be in place. There are specific letters of support. But in many grant programs, they do allow for that multiple different methods to show the collaboration and that you're not working in a silo. I think it's important to think about why community support is important, because it's not just Melissa, or it's not just Melissa's agency or organization that is, really pursuing my own initiatives. We are spurring economic development. We have fostered support from the community. We have other stakeholders who are invested in the success of this project. And obviously, an agency or a foundation wants to fund a project that's going to get off the ground and that's going to be sustainable. So that's really where that community support plays such an impactful part. So you can give surveys, you can post on Facebook and ask for responses. There are lots of free tools that allow you to kind of poll the community. You can speak at board meetings. Again, we talked a little bit about state and local government, and whether it's a school board meeting or whether it's a town board meeting, really finding ways that you can show that community support and involve that in your application. And one of the things that I'll say about letters of support, and again, follow your guidance, whatever, if they're asking for a specific template or formula, which we'll talk about, absolutely use those things. But if it is just collecting letters of support to show that community involvement, there's nothing more boring than reading the same letter of support over and over and over. And I would venture to say that sometimes they don't get read if they are just the identical letter. They may take a look at who actually sent it and how it relates to the project. But when you've got sort of a plethora of community members that would be affected, as well as your congressman, all sorts of letters in different types. Some of the grants that I've reviewed or at least had eyes on have even had pictures drawn from young children who, by enabling particular access in their community, are finding new pathways, seeing things for the first time because of this grant funding. So I think that those are all really unique, and again, we want to talk about ways to make your grant competitive, compelling, and a standout among others. That's really important. So finding those collaborators, those partnerships, using multiple methods, and again, knowing that even if it is not a requirement, which many times it is, that it is typically highly encouraged when it comes to the success of your application. And Megan, I'm going to give it to you to speak a little bit to the community benefit agreements.
Absolutely. And I will, but first I want to say that I want every application now to have hand-drawn pictures from children.
Right?
I love that idea. I hope everyone takes that away from this as like one of the key points is to have hand-drawn pictures. I love that. Yeah, so community benefit agreements, really when it comes to these infrastructure grants, right? So when we're thinking not just broadband, but transportation, wastewater, community benefits agreements really started in development. So when people were doing building in communities, developers would come in and create these community benefit agreements, these contracts, saying we will provide these benefits to the community in exchange for your support of our project. And so we have had grant applications guidance coming out that call specifically, do you have community benefit agreements? And it might seem a little scary because it's, in a contract, but these are usually things that if you're doing infrastructure, you would be doing anyway, partly because they're required, right? You're often required to have competitive wages. So you're often required to hire locally. So what you're doing in a community benefit can often just be these things you're going to be doing anyway that benefit the community. What you're doing here is letting the community know that you're doing them, letting the community know that these great things will be coming to them, and then getting that in writing, getting an agreement saying, this countywide foundation, this town foundation, this neighborhood group offers their support in this community benefit agreement. So again, it started as something that we saw a lot more with developers, but you can really use it for all sorts of things. If you have a project that will provide benefits to a community, a CBA. And that's again, when Melissa mentioned multiple methods, it's another method. It's another kind of way of showing this depth and breadth of the community support that you have. So again, it is sometimes more on the infrastructure side of grants, but certainly if you want to have one for a DLT or for an education grant, go for it, right? Again, that multiple methods and as much as you can demonstrate.
Absolutely.
6, offer clarity.
Fun. So this is very important to, again, Megan is obviously more on the writing side of the house. I am more of a project manager. So I have my eyes on lots of grants. And the logic of your narrative is incredibly important. And again, I mentioned in Megan's world, there are speeds and feeds and things. And if I am having to hop from page 7 back to page 3 and really try to puzzle piece this together, as Megan said, that causes me frustration, it causes confusion. And so you really want to, one, follow the guidance. If there's a workflow that they want you to follow, absolutely, we're not saying, don't follow that. However, in certain grants, you do have some flexibility to how you present the information, and you want it to flow logically. And one of the examples that I'm going to use is when you have to offer, we'll call a needs and benefits example, and you're highlighting multiple program areas where different needs are going to be addressed through this funding, and then highlight specific benefits or outcomes because of this funding. So if I am addressing 3 different subject areas, and I go through all of those areas, and then on my next page, I'm telling you how this addresses 1, 2, and 3. Well, by the time I get to 1, I may not even remember what your second specific project that you were outlining did. So when I say do it logically, I mean, follow a flow. So this is one of our major needs. This is how this need is going to be addressed through this funding. And here are some specific outcomes that we project. And do that for need number 2 and need number 3. So again, follow the guidance to a T, but have some sort of common sense and logic when it comes to the person reviewing this grant. Again, is not only maybe not an expert in this area, but they don't know your community and they don't know your project or your logic model. So make sure that those things are followed. Also using consistent terminology. And in the grants world, we love acronyms. I would venture to say more than anything else, we'd love to put an acronym.
More acronyms than your teen loves, and teens love acronyms.
Absolutely. Like, we might love acronyms as much as we love gifts. So this is, we get it. We get it. However, not everyone knows what you're saying, and you want to use consistent terminology. This could also be for a building, or a university. Universities obviously might not be the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You might refer to it as UNCCH. So identifying how you are going to name or call an organization, whatever it may be, a town. And even if you are going to then decide to use that acronym moving forward, make sure you identify it, you address it as the acronym, address that moving forward, this will be referred to as such, and be consistent through every piece of your grant. Because again, if you've referenced the University of North Carolina, and then you're saying UNCCH, and you might have multiple locations. I hope I don't get in trouble for naming specific names. Sorry, any Chapel folks, alumni over here speaking.
Exactly. But they'll probably support you.
I just gave a big example. Hopefully we didn't lose any audience members. Hopefully we gained a lot of cheers. But that being said, regardless, whether it's an organization or a term, Megan has a lot of, megahertz and gigahertz and ups and downs, refer to them consistently throughout your grant. And again, we want to go back to some of our previous our previous slides and say, be consistent, be clear, make sure that your reviewer knows who you're talking about, what you're talking about as well. And then include all of the steps of your project. You can't really talk about the need and what all of the challenges and the pain points and say, but if we get this grant, all is well, rainbows and unicorns, and we've solved the world's problems. You really have to highlight how this funding is going to be leveraged to provide access, to provide equity, all of those things that, as Megan said, are in the guidance as what are key priorities for that specific program. So you want to make sure you take them from the start of that project through the end of that project. And many want to know about sustainability as well. So even beyond the project, how you're going to be able to sustain that. And Megan, I'll let you put your grant writer hat on and talk about the importance of taking breaks. I think this is a good opportunity to say sometimes you just have to walk away for a minute.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I cannot stress taking breaks enough. And it can be hard sometimes, right? When we're up against deadlines, when we've got 2 weeks left, it might be tempting to just push. Don't do that. Take breaks. Allow yourself to reset, because when you come back, that's when you're really going to be able to offer the clarity. When you go back and look, this is what we don't want our reviewers to do. If you don't take breaks, this will be your reviewer. And this was not a good episode for David. Very frustrated. So make sure you take those breaks. Make sure you're letting yourself reset. So when you come back to it, you're fresh and you can offer the clarity to the reviewers. Again, so they can be a different GIF of David. This is the wrong GIF for reviewers. 7.
Oh, sorry. That was me.
Well, we can share controls now. We figured it out. So everyone should be happy about that. Okay, number 7, edit then edit again, which comes back a little bit to take a break, what I was just saying, but it is so important here to edit and then edit again, come back. First, oh gosh, I did that this time. Okay. Edit, then edit again, and then practice again. No, so I would say when you're editing, you want to do both a substantive review, meaning that you look to see that you've captured everything that they requested in that NOFO, which you read all 300 pages of. So doing the substance review, and then also a grammatical review. So making sure that, again, you're using proper grammar, that you don't have incorrect grammar or, semicolons or parentheses where they shouldn't be. A great way to kind of know if you're using the correct grammar is using technology tools. So I know both Google and Microsoft Word can read things out loud to you. And when you hear things, you can catch the difference between your theirs and theirs, your brothers, your others, things that it's not going to, put your squiggly underline because it's spelled wrong. But just because it could be your fingers were going too fast and you put in the wrong word. So having it read it out loud to you is a great way to catch those grammatical and those spelling errors. I know some people don't like the sound of the robots that Google and Microsoft have, and if that is the case for you, a great tip is to read your grant backwards. And when you read it backwards, it forces your brain to focus on every word. And that's, again, when you're going to catch some of those grammatical things that, you would get when you hear it out loud. So try reading your grant backwards if you can't stand robots. Another one, use member of your team in other departments. So this is great, when I'm doing, for example, a broadband grant, and I want to make sure that it can be understood, right? So I give it to Melissa, and Melissa says, this makes no sense. As my daughter would say, WTF, what is this? Reading this, giving it to people outside of your department can make sure that you are presenting it in a way that can be understood by any reviewer. And then using members of your team to review, because they are going to know what you need to be doing in the grant, right? They've also read the NOFO. So having multiple people from different areas review your grant is a great way to edit then edit again. And another thing with that is, if you're like me, sometimes you type faster, or you think typer, you can't speak. If you're like me, or you think faster than you type. And sometimes when you do that, you have very strangely worded sentences. And so maybe they make sense to you because your brain is catching it, but it might not make sense to others. So again, that's when it's really helpful to have other people review your narrative. And then again, take a break. Go watch some Schitt's Creek, walk away, come back, and you're going to catch a lot more things that might have been unclear that you recognize now you need to make clear. So cannot stress enough taking a break when you're doing this, because that's when you're going to get, again, all these errors and create a more compelling narrative because your reviewer isn't getting caught up on these things. Take a break. Those are our tips, 7 tips here. You might have noticed they all had to do with writing and the substance of writing, but there are other parts of a grant, the not writing part. So what we've seen in infrastructure grants recently, not recently, but forever, is having audited financial statements, right, and finances. So finances are always going to be a big part of your grant, no matter what you're doing. So making sure these kinds of things are in order, that you've identified the person in your organization who will be in charge of the monies, and making sure that they provide what they need to you. When it comes to mapping and data points, you want to make sure that you have all of those ready, and that you can think creatively about them, right? So again, as Melissa has said before, if the guidance tells you to do one thing and that thing only do that. But if you're doing mapping and you say, hey, I can actually add data into this GIS map that shows this statistic or this interesting fact or this thing about natural disasters, don't be afraid to put that in. Again, you're creating a more compelling application there, and that's outside of your narrative. But making sure that you are hitting all of the data points in your maps that they want to see, that you're showing things correctly that they want to see, whether it's broadband or transportation, whatever it might be, making sure that those are in line, you're having people review them, and that you go back to your guidance again to make sure that you're capturing the finances and the mapping and data point that are required of you. Nitty-gritty budget details. So this is one that I have come across quite a few times, and this is to really break down your grant budget. So do not just say materials. Materials is not an acceptable line item, and you will get pushback. You will have you'll get dismissed because they say you don't know what you're talking about. You just gave us $3 million for materials. If they decide to give you a chance, you're going to go through and through and through reiterations, and you don't want to have to do that. So from the get-go, break down your budget into nitty-gritty details so they know that you know exactly what it takes to do your project and how much it's going to cost. This doesn't mean putting down the SKU numbers for every single nail and nut and bolt, but again, showing that you can break this down, you understand the components, and you understand what they cost, that you're not just lumping it in together into one line item. And then Melissa is going to tell you about our last 2 points here.
And absolutely, while I'm going over these points, Megan, there is a question from our friend Scott Woods in the chat that I would love for you to look at, because I think that it makes a great point. And I think we should discuss that after these couple bullet points, which one are using the worksheets. And so many times you are giving worksheets or templates in your grant guidance or as attachments or addendums. Use those worksheets. I know sometimes you think it is a template. It is not. More times than not, it is not. Just plan on using those worksheets. Admittedly, there could be errors in the formulas and you might want to rework that. But if they've given you a specific worksheet, that is what you want to use. What is within the grant guidance, within the application, the NOFO, use those worksheets, even if you think it's a suggestion. It's typically not a suggestion. So if you need to make amendments to those particular worksheets, because again, just sometimes with different platforms between Excel and Google Drive, there can be some errors within the formulas, but use those as, just don't even use the word template, just use those particular worksheets. And same with compliance documents. You are contracting, and I'm specifically going to speak to federal opportunities at this point. You are under contract with the federal government, and so there's not a lot of back and forth on, oh well, we want to take our attorneys and have them look at this before we sign it and redline it up. Typically it is what it is, and so it is. You can amend your compliance documents. You can't typically make addendums to your compliance documents. It's very specific. What they are typically in the attachments of the NOFO or the application guide, and so use the compliance documents. And I want to take this a step further. If something should be on letterhead, if someone with obvious fiscal authority needs to sign something, if you need someone who is designated an AOR with that signature, be sure you include those things above and beyond. Again, that these are the not writing part things are sadly what can get your grant kicked out, and all this lovely narrative that we've spent 45 minutes talking to you about means nothing if one of these sections is gone. Typically it doesn't even get reviewed. And so with that, and with time in mind, talking about review, Megan, would you like to address Mr. Wood's
Absolutely.
question?
I think that is the perfect segue, talking about review, to Scott's question. So Scott asked discussion on who reviews these. The reviewing process of federal grant programs, it is not just going to the issuing agency, right? So a good example here is NTIA. They are putting out many broadband grants. They go through that first round of reviews and say, these are the applications that are going to that next round. That next round goes to a different federal agency for review. And that federal agency very often does not have the knowledge that those at the original issuing agency who made the program, who understand it, that second agency may not have that knowledge. Again, this is going to come back then to making sure that anyone can understand your application. Also comes back to using the worksheets. So that second agency is going to be looking at those worksheets. They're relying on them. So if you change that, if you, edit it in some way, if you make it different, if, as Melissa says, you're not already kicked out of the process, if it gets through, that second agency is going to be relying on that specific thing. And if they see you have not done it that way, then you will get kicked out, right? Because they are coming in as that second set of eyes that doesn't know outside of the program, that doesn't know kind of creative, that doesn't know the deep substance, the background knowledge that the issuing agency does. So making sure that you use the templates, that you write in a way that can be understood by all parties. Again, making sure that that nitty-gritty detail is there, because usually that second agency is the one that's looking at the fiscal portion. They're the ones that are looking to make sure all of the money lines up, that it's consistent, and that you're accounting for everything that you would need. Again, it's important to remember that it's many eyes, whether it's, the first set of eyes in that first stage or at the end stage. Many people are going to be looking at your application, and you want all of them to be able to understand it and have an easy answer. I get it. They hit it. They used the templates. I know what to do here. And it's a great question. Melissa and I were both on an email this morning that had someone reach out from that second agency. And so we responded, and I'm actually going to then lead that into our oh, well, crap. We have another gift. Moira Griff, you wrote a broadband grant. We will come back to this.
Now we're getting questions.
We'll come back to the Moira, because absolutely we should. But what I wanted to do is go to lessons learned, because one of our lessons learned is that you need to be prepared to drop everything to answer these questions from reviewers. If it's a great sign if they are following up, but they typically will give you a very short turnaround, sometimes 24 hours. So be prepared to answer these questions. Ideal world, you don't have any because you followed all of the guidance rules and you used the templates and you made everything understandable. But again, if one of those sets of eyes from a different agency, from a different reviewer as you go along, has a question and asks for clarification, you typically have a very short window to provide them an answer. And that is a lesson we have learned, to be prepared to drop what you're doing to make sure you get those answers to them.
And to monitor your spam and your junk mail for those. If you have a grant in review, I'm terrible, admittedly terrible at not looking at my junk or spam for weeks on end. If there is a review and there's a chance that there may be a question, all hands on deck when it comes to monitoring all of your email, checking voicemail, things like that, because as Megan said, you sometimes have a very, very tight window. And if you don't respond, then they're on to the next application.
Yeah. So I will say, if anyone has other questions, I know we're getting towards the end of our hour. Please put them in the chat now. We are happy to answer. As they come in, as you're thinking of them, we can continue to kind of talk here about our other lessons learned. 2 weeks out is too late to start. Maybe you can get it done in 2 weeks, but you're not going to have the competitive application that you want to have. And especially, again, we're in the age of billions and trillions. You've got a lot of competition. 2 weeks out, you're not going to be competitive. I'm sorry. You may think you're the best ever, and you might be. I guarantee you the people who have been working on this for 2 months have a much stronger application and will be the more competitive. So 2 weeks out is too late to start.
And I will also say that I know that I just spent a lot of time talking about fostering community support and collaboration and partnerships. But when you are in the process of a grant application, there are too many cooks in the kitchen at sometimes. There is such thing as too big of a team, too many voices, too many demands, to be able to have, as we said, a very logical workflow and grant and process. So that we do want you to foster that community support. We do want you to invest in different stakeholders and collaborators. Know that sometimes you really do have to streamline that team. You have to have a project manager who is very strong in being able to kind of shut some of those voices down or be able to open them up at the appropriate times. But it can be incredibly frustrating if there are too many collaborators. So you want a healthy balance there.
And the last point there, your narrative can be too long. Again, we took what was it, probably 45 minutes to tell you all these great ways that you could do your narrative. But absolutely, if you have a word limit, stick within your word limit. If you don't have a word limit, your narrative can still be too long, right? So when we say paint a picture, think of painting the Mona Lisa and not the Sistine Chapel, right? Like, you can be too long, you can be too big, you can be too much. So don't be that. Don't necessarily be the Alexis of grant writing. She is sometimes too much. You want to be concise but powerful. So your narrative can be too long. So just something to be aware of, which again, in your editing and review process, you might and probably would have a colleague who say, wow, you get really verbose in here. So again, sticking within your word limits if you have them, and your narrative can't be too long.
Perfect. Megan, I'll throw our contact information up as well. We do have another question from Katrina about recommendations for justifying community needs, what resources you would recommend. We're in the age of the World Wide Web, where we have lots and lots of resources, not all of them good or the appropriate ones. So one thing that I will just add in general, if you can take information from the funding agency, that's huge. I love to take something an agency has published or a mapping tool that they have created or provided or language that they have used and throw that right back at them, because it is, if whatever agency is putting out this grant opportunity, if you could give their information back. But definitely the U.S. Census website is a wealth of information when it comes to things like population, median household income, race and gender, all of those different kind of specs. Megan, don't know, we're running out of time, but do you have some resources that you recommend as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely say look at community forums. So when you're justifying community need, looking to the community. So sometimes, the local housing authority will have specific data points on that community, right, through what they do in the housing authority. It could be some other local state or local government agency that has collected data points. So reaching out, seeing like, hey, we're doing this kind of grant. We know you might touch it in this way. Do you have data on this, right? So looking large scale, as you say, Melissa, at Census, they do a great job of letting you compare side by side for your state, your county, and US. But then also looking at that smaller side of what local branches of government might have in terms of data. And that, is also a great source and a very hard fact source of justifying your community need. There's always the difference between the hard facts and then your anecdotes. You need a great mix of both. But again, those local hard facts are really great to support your grant, as well as what you can find from the census.
Perfect. Well, I think we've covered all of the questions. We have taken almost all of your time of the full hour, which I didn't think we were going to be able to do, but I hope that you all hung in there with us, that you took something from this. Our contact information is here as well. You can follow Learn, Design, Apply on LinkedIn, as well as visit our website for additional resources. Again, if we didn't get to a question, or you think of a question later, please don't hesitate. We're done.
As promised, we're back to Moira Gift.
We're back.
And I feel we're changing this as we speak to you attended our grant writing webinar. So
congrats.
Congratulations. Have your Moira moment.
So Megan, we will we'll be following up with the recording. Again, you can get us on LinkedIn, visit our website. We would love to talk more about Learn, Design, Apply, how we can support you in your grant efforts. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Absolutely. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks, Megan. It was a great time.
It was. All right. Bye.
Bye, everyone.